Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. 11.1.5 has dropped, and that also brings the WoW Cooldown Manager, and I finally got a chance to test it out, mess around with it, and I wanted to give my thoughts as well as some of the hints that Blizzard has given for the future, as it looks like they're trying to take on the third-party tools, the add-ons, the Weakauras that have just dominated the game for a really long time, and I'm really hopeful that it continues. So let's start with, first off, what they've been doing with the Cooldown Manager is they have pre-assigned structures for tracking major abilities, buffs, and a couple of utility spells. They basically break it up into major abilities, utility spells, buffs, and some other key trackers that you have, some temporary buffs. And as a result, there's a couple pre-assigned structures. You can have them vertical, horizontal. You can kind of choose how deep the rows go. There's not a lot, but it does show you a good amount of your abilities. Unfortunately, it's pretty limited. There's some weird things going on with it where it shows flash heal, and prayer of healing as a holy priest, even though those don't have cooldowns at all. You play Disc Priest and you cast Powered Shield on yourself. Instead of being able to see the Powered Shield cooldown, like if you cast it on somebody else, it shows the buff up time on you. So you can't see when the next cooldown comes back for something like Powered Shield or even Renew. Same kind of story. And some buffs are missing entirely. When you're supposed to track certain buffs, it tracks things like Wheel and Woe as Disc Priest. But as a Holy Priest, it doesn't track Resonant Words, which is a very important buff for a lot of Holy Priest players. So there's a lot of customization lacking. Some good news is that there is an add-on called the WoW Cooldown Customizer that is trying to adjust some of these issues, which is ironic because you're having an add-on to adjust the in-game setup. You know, kind of strange, but it does allow you to remove, flash heal, prayer of healing, heal, and then you can also add other cooldowns. Unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't have the capability to reorder the cooldowns, but I think that's one of the most requested features. I reached out to the add-on developer, and he said there's quite a few limitations that Blizzard's put into the add-on for how much he can mess with it, but he is working to find some kind of adjustments and to be able to further build up this add-on. And Mangozilla, the developer of the Cooldown Customizer, is not alone in wanting to make sure they add on to it. Blizzard's had a few tweets and they've had a few posts about the Cooldown Manager saying that they want to make sure that they're developing more features. They've even said that they have more add-on info coming soon, whatever that might mean. So I'm very hopeful that this is sort of the beginning of them taking the war to add-ons and Weakauras and things along those lines. Now, I'm not saying they should just get rid of them entirely or anything along those lines. If they removed an add-on like Sexy Maps, I'd be pretty sad. It doesn't have any sort of crazy performance benefit, but I like being able to change how my mini-map looks. I think the biggest thing is that a lot of add-ons are just mandatory if you wanted to play the game at a competitive level, to track your buffs, to track debuffs, to track boss abilities, and most importantly, I would say, to assign abilities and to assign cooldowns to players for raid boss fights. Even in M+, this is also a really growing pattern as well. I was doing a gore chop in Theater of Pain recently, and somebody was like, hey, it's crazy that you don't have the Weakaura that shows when the little mini ads are going to jump on cooldown. And it's really insane that you're not tracking that and everything. And I thought to myself, I'm like, well, usually my nameplates have cooldown trackers, but you're right. That would be something that's super helpful to take on these fights. Now, the worst offenders are absolutely the raid encounters. Styx Bunk Junker, Sprocket Monger, Mugsy, to name a few of them, have all of these different assignments for the Weakauras, where the add-on, the software is telling you where to stand and who is breaking the mines, who is soaking which pile of garbage, who's going into which position for the jails on Mugsy, all of these kind of things. And enough's enough, honestly. If we're trying to go into the long-term view of WoW, and that means you got to bring in new blood, right? And I think that's a very large issue that's looming over WoW as the player base, naturally gets older and people move on to different things, have different interests. Some people go to Classic, some people go to Hardcore Classic, some people go into Mock Classic, Cata Classic, whatever. The game starts spreading out, and if you want to bring in new people into the game, you can't be having this, hey, go to the third-party site, download these tools, then they'll assign you where to stand, what to do, how to push your buttons. and so on and so forth. Something has to change. And so I hope that this is the catalyst, and I hope that this is sort of the beginning of the conversation. Because in Dragonflight, they tried with the private auras to basically say, you are not going to be able to track this buff, or you're not going to be able to track this ability. And it failed miserably. People found workarounds, people found the little like macro press to assign the weak aura to tell everybody what to do, where to stand, and people found their way around that with the sneak.lua tech, and so Blizzard just gave up on most of the private auras, or the majority of them. There's still a few. That being said, this needs to be the sort of catalyst for the future, and I think if they start with a cooldown manager and start working towards that being a full-fledged replacement for class weak auras as an example, that would be huge. And hey, if you make it so that you can only have, rows and columns, but if you wanted to have a smiley face with your setup, you might need an add-on. That's totally fine. If some of the things coming into it are just a little bit how they appear, then that's a great use for weak auras. But what concerns me is the fact that they publish like new raid frames and not being able to adjust them, not being able to have much customization for them, especially when you're getting into dungeon environments where there's 50 million mobs and you're trying to figure out what does stuff, is insanely challenging for new players to start getting into the mix. And that's why I think the over-reliance on these third-party tools raises the sort of like barrier of entry to get people into the game and to help them understand the game and like what's going on. And that's a huge reason why you see people just kind of yoink a content creator's weak aura pack or UI pack. Mine's in the description down below if you want mine, right? And that works, that's fine, but I don't think that's a sustainable solution for the long-term player base, especially when you have some games coming out in the future like Fellowship, which is basically like WoW M+ as a standalone game. They don't have any add-ons, they're not having any weak auras. The UI is just the UI. And I think that's really going to be pushing Blizzard going forward to be making some changes. And I hope that this is sort of the beginning of the catalyst to start making a lot of adjustments. I don't want to take away anybody's, add-ons or weak auras to collect achievements or mogs or toys or any of that kind of stuff. I'm talking from the competitive perspective that if you want to understand what your character's doing, understand what the boss fights are doing, you shouldn't be so reliant on the add-ons and weak auras. A really underrated thing that they've kind of done radar-wise is improve a lot of the in-game music and voice lines for bosses to the point that it actually feels like you can kind of understand what the abilities are going to be once you kind of assign the voice line with like what the ability is. That's actually been pretty good, and I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about that. That being said, how do you start getting players who've played the game for decades to actually turn on the in-game music and start listening to what the bosses are saying? That might be a little bit hard, but we'll have to see. If I've missed anything, or you think there's certain things they should absolutely be killing off or working to replace, let me know as well. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. But for me, I think the best thing that Blizzard could do is, as best as they can, pump as much of the pseudo-mandatory things that weak auras are doing in particular, put it into the baseline game, and that will then give them the opportunity to start culling down on what weak auras can do while not screwing over anybody's player experience. I really think that raid fights are going to get even more fun in a lot of ways when you don't actually have the add-ons assigning you what to do and you're instead looking at the encounter, you're looking at the environment, and that is telling you what to do. That is telling you where to stand. That is giving you the information that you need to draw for your own experiences. That would be a huge thing for me, but I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts as well. So thanks so much for checking this video out, and big love to our patrons for making all this content possible. If you want to join them, check them out in the description down below. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.